Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Icarus, and yes, we're back to Whipping Girl. Chapter 9, which is called Ungendering in Art and Academia. You see me looking this way, I put my laptop down so I can hold my puppy, because she is a baby, and I am a sucker. I did not make a TLDR of this particular chapter, I think mostly because it was pretty short, and as usual, I disagree with almost everything Serrano has to say. I also was just like, when I saw the chapter title, Art in Academia, considering I am an artist who is very interested in academia, I was just like, cool. So this chapter is designed to completely make me hate it, I suppose. But that is going a bit ahead of things. I will now put my puppy down, despite my greater needs, so I can pick up my laptop. Alright, so it opens up with a quote that says, "People use books on gender to invisibilize transsexuals." I'm not sure invisibilize is a word. It is from Kate Bornstein, and there's a footnote. And I wrote, "From what I can tell, this crazy-ass footnote says it's a quote either from the author or the book she wrote in a book review that I can't find archived online. Talk about convoluted and inaccessible." This is a really big problem with reading this book in the year of our Hellfire 2022, which I think is just a result of time. As I've mentioned before, a lot of the terminology that Serrano uses is now considered outdated by 2022 standards, like transsexuals. It's not used nearly as much. Hi, Dory. And then there is another quote that says, "Sometimes I think they just don't want to hear the real stories. I get cynical and think, who wants the everyday details of someone's life when you can use people with intersex to fulfill erotic fantasies, narrative requirements, and research programs?" Via Hillman. And of course another footnote. I appreciate that she's actually telling us where these are from, even if I can't necessarily find them. And I remember I did dig deep for this one because it was like a review that was on a website that no longer had that review. So then I had to go into the web archive, the Wayback Machine, and it actually had it saved. And that happens a lot in this chapter. It's just like a lot of online takes that are not academic, that are more or less like secondhand accounts that she's using. It's kind of like the problem when we talked about the fact that I am having to read a book that was written by a middle-class white educated woman who read a book by a middle-class white educated man about third gender identities in like the Mohawk Nation. So we're ending up with that again. Fortunately, I am able to find some of this stuff, and I wrote, the footnote said it was from the ISNA News, which the first ISNA I found was Islamic Student Organization. Yeah, the Iranian Students News Agency. So I had to reassess, look up Thea Hillman, whose website calls her an award-winning author and communications specialist passionate about working collaboratively to make the world a better place. And it mentions that she was a former chair to the Intersex Society of North America. That's the correct ISNA. I couldn't find her review, but a broken link in the Wayback Machine actually helped me find it. And it is a review on it's called Middlesex and the Limitations of Myth. It's a review on the book Middlesex, which does come up later in the chapter. And I feel like this review is short enough. I am just going to read it to you. It opens up with an editor's note. Lots of people have been asking ISNA board members what we think of Jeffrey Gindy's new hit novel, Middlesex. The book, informed by ISNA's work and publications, mentions the Intersex Society of North America by name. The protagonist is even a member of the ISNA, and Mr. Eugenides has said publicly that he hopes the book advances the intersex rights movement. It has certainly made many more people aware of intersex, the complexities of life with intersex, and ISNA, and we are grateful for that. We asked our board chair, Thea Hillman, to share with you her own personal thoughts on the book and its buzz, and here we are. People keep asking me about Jeffrey Eugenides, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, new novel Middlesex, because the main character is considered a hermaphrodite, and so am I. But really, neither of us is. Outside of myth, there are no hermaphrodites. It is physiologically impossible to both be fully male and fully female. But you can be born with a mix, or blending, of male and female parts known as intersex, and indeed this is what Eugenides' protagonist, Cal, and I have in common. People with intersex conditions are those who are born with sexual anatomy that someone else decided isn't standard for males or females. Unlike Hermaphroditus, the mythical creature who is both a man and a woman, people with intersex conditions are not magical, or not even that rare. Every year in the US, approximately 1 in every 2,000 babies are born with an intersex condition, which makes intersex more common than cystic fibrosis. Which makes intersex more common with cystic fibrosis. Intersex conditions include congenital adrenal hyperplasia, Klinefelter syndrome, androgen sensitivity syndrome, MRKH, and gonadal dysgenesis, amongst others. Why all the mystery and secrecy then? Because we're talking about genitals here, and sex, and our intersex bodies have become collision sites for Western society's obsession with sex and fear of difference. Intersex bodies are considered freakish because society has fallen prey to the myth that humans are sexually dimorphic, that is, all women look like X and are designed to have sex with men, while all men look like Y and are designed to have sex with women. Problem is, that's just not what happens in real life. Aside, I do like the fact that women are X and men are Y. That's just personally funny to me because of the whole bioessentialism shit. In real life, variations in genes, hormones, and maternal environment mean that some boys are born with very small penises or undescended testes, and some girls are born with enlarged clitorises or without a vagina. More and more people, including parents and doctors, are learning that our intersex bodies are just one of the many ways that human bodies vary. Unfortunately, many people in hospitals with decision-making power consider our genitals defective, even though in most cases they are perfectly healthy. Another aside, I found out from my doctor, I may have mentioned this before, but I've had very little bottom growth, and my doctor said that if I had been born a cis dude, I likely would have had a very small penis. So each day in the US, 5 babies born with intersex conditions are subjected to unnecessary plastic surgeries on their genitals. It's standard operating procedure to treat an intersex birth as a psychosocial emergency and to perform cosmetic sexual surgery as early as possible. There's another myth that intersex will go away with corrective surgery. It doesn't, but cessation often does. Yet many people, including many physicians who treat intersex, remain under the illusion that technology can and should fix everything, and that anything that's different should be corrected regardless of risk. This belief keeps them from listening to real people with intersex conditions, many of whom challenge unnecessary surgeries. None of us object to surgery that preserves health or life, but these surgeries are performed for social reasons, not medical ones. Sometimes I think they just don't want to hear the real stories. I get cynical and think, who wants the everyday details of someone's life when you can use people with intersex to fulfill erotic fantasies, narrative requirements, and research programs? People with intersex continue to be used to satisfy the interest of others, as scientific specimens, as naked teaching models for medical students, as literary metaphors, as gags for popular sitcoms, and lastly, where at least we might get a cut of the profits as circus freaks and peep show attractions. Intersex has increasingly been in the public eye due to the work of the intersex rights movement, led by the Intersex Society of North America. The result has been that Eugenides and others are now realizing how compelling the idea of intersex is. Problem is, few of them are actually talking to people with intersex. But we've been here all along, and we have plenty to tell. What we have to say may shock and surprise you. We're not actually all that different. We are women, men, and occasional alternative genders such as transgender, just like non-intersex people. We are straight, gay, married, single, just like non-intersex people. We like to decide what happens to our bodies and like to be asked about our lives rather than told. We've told our own stories in books, websites, and videos. I can promise you they are far more moving and powerful than any fictionalized account. While the myth of hermaphroditus has captured the imagination for ages, it traps real human beings in the painfully small confines of someone else's stories. So you can see she is cherry picking a very small section of this review that is mostly not even a review of the book to make her own point, which, yeah, that has its time and place, but it feels a little disingenuous, especially as we get into uh, the actual chapter, because again, these are just the opening quotes. And I made a note here saying the book review isn't really a book review so much as a post talking about how intersex people are just people and have their own stories to tell that will be much more compelling than any fictionalized story. I like and hate people like fictional stories of other types of people just as much. The earlier ideas that Serrano has talked about with fetishizing real people, etc. So those are my thoughts around that. The whole idea of it also plays into the idea that you cannot write people if you are not part of that society, which I think is a brain dead take, and it really limits people. Unfortunately, in the world that we live in, the people with people with privilege and rights and all this bullshit over other people, which again is absolute bullshit and should not be a thing. Oftentimes, those people with the privilege can help uplift other voices, but the way to start with that is having people write about this. And some of it's going to be bad, a lot of it's going to be bad, but then you end up with people who actually do the research, and then they get platforms, and their platforms they can lift up people who have those conditions and have been writing their own stories. And then we get to the point where it's like you have the people being all, well, you're not part of this community, so you can't write jack shit. And I have very complicated feelings about that as someone who's a writer himself. So we're actually going to get into the actual chapter now. And the first mention that I highlight is the same can also be said for depictions of other gender variant people, i.e. those who deviate in some way from societal expectations of femaleness and maleness. And I made a note that is because this is about how transgender people are supposed to be reinforcing the binary, essentially. So I highlighted the same can also be said for other gender variant people, and it was like, as in they're a distinct class of sex from male or female, or are they still forced into binaries? Because the latter could be talked about even today. In this chapter, I describe a more recent reciprocal phenomenon, which I call ungendering, where gender variant people are used as a device to bring conventional notions about maleness and femaleness into question. And I just wrote she's going to be talking about intersex people and possibly gender nonconforming people, which, again, I've had problems from the previous chapters. The most easily highlightable one being the way she talked about the Mohawk tribe and how their third sex or third gender identities are actually trans women without having the word trans woman, and how they're ostracized and all of that stuff. In theory, any person can be ungendered simply by dwelling on the aspects of their gendered appearance, expressions, and identity that differ from the norm, but this practice seems to most focus on transsexual and intersex people. Here I discuss the practice of ungendering as it occurs in cis-sexual works of fiction, like movies and novels, and in academia. In both cases, ungendering is an exploitative process involving both the appropriation of gender-variant bodies and experiences while erasing intersex and transsexual voices and perspectives. And my note is, this is a fairly short chapter. In my notes, with my notes, it's 12 pages long. And the fact that she's cramming fiction and nonfiction into this is interesting. Capitalizing on transsexuality and intersexuality is our first subheading. And I'm just going to read the first, I'm going to read the first couple paragraphs. A classic example of ungendering can be found in the Emmy Award nominated HBO movie Normal, which depicts a trans woman named Roy who comes out to her family as trans. The movie focuses on how Roy's revelation and her ensuing transition affects her relationship with her wife and children in their small Midwestern town. In an interview about the film that appeared on HBO.com, writer and director Jane Anderson said that despite the fact that the subject of transsexuality dominates much of the film, she did not envision Normal as a story chronicling the adventures of a transgender person, but rather as a study of one married couple's love for one another. So if the movie is not about transsexuality per se, then why did this non-trans filmmaker go to the trouble of including a transsexual character? Anderson explained that she used transsexuality primarily as a device to challenge the couple's relationship. In fact, she draws a comparison between the way she employs transsexuality and the way other writers have used extramarital affairs in the past. While Anderson seems to believe that stories that center on extramarital affairs have become passé, both because the premise has been overused by writers and because many people continue to love the person who has cheated on them, she views transsexuality as ultimate betrayal that can occur within a marriage. Well, this is another interview that I could not find until I literally dug through the web archive, and I actually had to go through clicking links, just looking. And I also watched Normal, and I don't think it was a bad film. I think that trans people forget, for a lot of our friends and family, that a lot of us don't show any signs of being trans. Like, yes, we do have the classic story of, I've known since I was 4 years old. I always played with Barbie dolls, wore my mom's heels, and tried on her makeup. That story. Or I was not like the other girls. I was a boy. I wanted to be a boy. When the boys would pull out their dicks to pee when they're like 5 years old, I tried and I was confused why I didn't have one. Those are classic, very classic stories that we know and is an intimate part of the fabric of trans stories. But there's just as many people that don't show signs, at least not very obvious signs. In this case, the main character of Normal was a very sensitive man. At least that's how people thought that she was. And she comes out after like 16 years of marriage and having 2 children, one of whom is full grown. So I guess more than 16 years, more like 25 years of marriage. And is like, hey, I've been a woman this entire time. I thought I was a man, but it never felt quite right, and I tried, and it's not me. And a lot of trans people forget that you're in your own head, and it can feel like a betrayal, especially if you've been presenting a certain way and acting like a certain way. It doesn't mean that you're less valid or that your feelings aren't real, and the hurt and betrayal that you get from someone not accepting you immediately or ever at all isn't valid and true. And ultimately, people should accept your identity, even if it means that they fall out of love with you. In this particular case, the main character and her wife do end up sticking together, but it's easy to demonize the cis people in our lives who don't understand, especially as this was in a small Midwestern-esque town. She was a factory worker, she went to church, so this is not really a place that would even really know about it, and she did all her research in secret, and she was adamant. I have been thinking about this for years, I'm going to do this, and I'm not saying don't be adamant about your sex change or choosing to transition. It's just like going from, I've been presenting all this, to in 2 years I plan on getting surgery because that's how long it will take for me to get my letter. That sort of thing it's a massive jump. And the older you get, the shorter a year feels, so it feels like no time at all. And that's an interesting phenomenon that I won't go into today. That essentially, the older you are, the more quickly time seems to go by. Whereas if you're like 10, a year seems like forever. But I looked up the interview, and I'm going to link all of these things because I'm not going to read through the entire interview. But I don't. It's just another case of Serrano taking a person's words and twisting it into the worst faith interpretation. And I may be overcorrecting because I am slowly developing this negativity towards what she's writing and trying to twist things into the best faith possible. I think Normal was a pretty serviceable film. I think I liked the ending. It didn't feel too much like trans or gay torture porn, in my opinion. And I feel like a lot of stuff went on, but ultimately the main character's transition was respected. That sort of thing. But we'll keep going. So, in other words, one of the characters, Roy, is ungendered in order to throw a monkey wrench into the couple's marriage. And transsexuality is no longer a marginalized identity or a grueling issue that real human beings struggle with. It is merely a literary device, a metaphor for the ultimate catastrophe that can strike a relationship. And this bothers me. Roy is not a real character. While there can be an argument in academia that people are ungendered, especially intersex versus parasex people, and transgender versus cisgender people, they can be ungendered and othered and be forced into boxes they don't fit in. But Roy is not a real character. And if anyone has read The Great Gatsby and seen the Green Lantern and knows that not all stories are necessarily a one-to-one. These are supposed to be real people. These are supposed to be a straightforward story. Like, you have chosen one stories where the chosen one is a metaphor for cataclysmic change, or the Lord of the Rings. You have all these unintentional allegories of like humans being the saviors and eventually taking over, and hobbits are more like the mythical bond with nature, and how they steadily disappear. Like, if you've read like the start of The Hobbit, there was a foreword in my copy of The Hobbit that talked about how hobbits were the quiet, sneaky sort that go unnoticed, and they were sort of like the quiet representation of nature that's still going on despite human advancement. And the whole elves being forced to leave because they no longer had a grasp on the world and had no place in it. Like, characters they're not real people. So using them as literary devices is not a bad thing. Even if they're trans, even if they're intersex. Ow, I just hit my hand against the wall. And sure, it may be gauche to some people to use being trans as a literary device, but especially from a cisgender person, but transformation has always been a literary device. Look at Beauty and the Beast. Beast was a selfish brat of a kid, or in some interpretations, a selfish brat of an adult who gets transformed into his ugliness comes out to the front. And a lot of the stories choose to have him transformed back into his former beauty simply because he has become beautiful on the inside. There's also the metaphors of people who choose to retain their monstrous appearance, and the idea that you don't have to be classically handsome to be a good person. That sort of thing. Choosing to embrace the ugliness that has been a part of you while still becoming a better person, which I personally like more than the original Beauty and the Beast, but you know. So I think it's not good to say that transsexuality, being transgender, can't sometimes be a metaphor. I can understand the trepidation of a cisgender person using it as such, but I think a lot of it depends on the execution, and I think Normal did pretty well in a realistic depiction of coming out as trans as a older middle-aged adult, and it wasn't torture porn. It just wasn't. So let's go on to the next one, and this kind of undermines like some of the stuff I said. You would think that Anderson, as a woman and a lesbian, would be aware of the troubling ways sexual minorities are portrayed and their voices silenced by the media, and that she would, at the very least, make a modest attempt to ensure that her character was respectful of the transsexual experience. Unfortunately, this is not the case. When an interviewer asked her if she drew on any sources when researching the movie, Anderson unabashedly answered that she relied solely on her imagination, that she made it all up herself. I say it undermines some of what I said. I'm talking about the fact that Anderson is a lesbian, so she actually has more of an understanding, as Serrano puts out, about sexual minorities, and especially in the early 2000s when lesbianism was still code for bisexual women and still mostly a genre of porn for cishet men to jack off to. But Serrano is once again twisting words, and this time actually in a bad faith interpretation. When you actually read the interview, and again, I will link it, Anderson talks about how for the actual characters and the story and that sort of thing, she did draw from her imagination, but she also did a lot of research to make sure that the transition process was medically accurate. And when you are studying medical transition, especially in the early 2000s, you'll find academic resources, but you're getting a lot of information from trans people. So she's being influenced, however subconsciously, by trans women explaining their experiences, explaining what they've been through, and that gets shown in the movie on the page. And this was originally a play. I don't know anything about the play. I'm only talking about the movie. So, Serrano goes on. She explained in the interview that she purposely set out to make sure that the audience would not take Roy seriously as a woman, which is not true at all. I literally just write bitch for where. Perhaps this is why Anderson makes no attempt to have any of the other characters come to relate to Roy as a female or use female pronouns when addressing her. And I write, it can't be that it's a Midwestern town, or that the daughter does address Ruth, Roy's chosen name, by her chosen name before she's chastised, or that it was explicitly mentioned that Irma will call Ruth, Irma being Ruth's wife, Irma will call Ruth by her name after her surgery, or that in the scene with the father, Ruth is allowed to call herself her father's daughter, and Ruth is never chastised or corrected. And to put some perspective in this. So it's a Midwestern small town. She went to church. Church tried to de-trans her. Subtly. She ends up being ostracized from the church. And that's the first time that Irma really takes a stand and goes to stand by her husband / spouse. And the daughter is younger, still lives with them. She's just started her own menstruation cycle, and she's just like, cool, my dad is a woman now. I am all in. I want to ask all of these questions. Ruth is very indulging and open about it. I think she loves the fact that she's able to talk to someone about it without judgment and without disgust. And there is a lot of talk of after your surgery, is mom still going to call you Roy? Why isn't mom calling you Roy? And Ruth is like, well, we agreed that she could call me Roy until my surgery. Then after that, I'll be Ruth. And she still wants to be called Dad. And The father is the Ruth's father is an older gentleman who's extremely close-minded. Really hated when Ruth was like a weepy, childish boy. But he also has Alzheimer's. And one of the last times we see Ruth's father, Ruth comes to visit, and Ruth's father is having some severe dementia, and is like, "Who are you?" And I'm like, Ruth's like, "I'm your daughter. I'm Ruth." The mom is in the background, and she doesn't try to correct Ruth. And the dad's just like, "Oh, I seem to have a lot of daughters. I thought I had a son." Ruth is like, "No, you never had a son," and stands up to her father for being sexist to um, his wife, and ends up taking over some of the caretaking duties of her father so that her mother can have a break. I really liked that scene. But apparently, Serrano is again looking at early 2000s movies with transgender people and is just like disgusted by them. Roy herself doesn't seem to protest this fact or assert her female identity at any point. In fact, she is inordinately meek and docile for someone who is in the process of coming out as transsexual. I wrote, seriously, also for someone so insistent on how this movie is somehow ungendering Ruth, you sure like to dead name her. And Ruth is, as a character, definitely not the aggressive type. And I think Serrano is again forgetting that not everyone is the same as her. We've seen that already a lot with some of her NB-phobia exorcism and her transandrophobia in earlier chapters, where she talks about how non-binary people are only partially expressing their subconscious sex, or thinking that trans men have it easier through the medical process than trans women. And here, she is looking at small acts of defiance that Ruth chooses to go through, and such as wearing women's cologne to work before she's transferred to a desk job. That way she can get away from some of the bullying that happens. But she wears women's perfume. She ends up wearing earrings. She has an earring torn out because the men that she's worked with and known her as Roy this entire time bully her. There's when she chooses to sing in her more feminine voice and she gets taken out of the choir. They're very small, subtle acts of defiance that someone may be watching and miss or dislike because it doesn't feel like it's a strong enough move. But I personally liked it as someone who was a lot slower and more tentative with my transition. I wish that I could have had the eventual acceptance and love that Irma gave Ruth from my mom. But I had to go to extremes. In a pre-movie interview, Tom Wilkinson, who played Roy in the made-for-cable movie, said, "I wanted to retain the kind of innocence about the whole thing that the guy had. He doesn't know quite what he's getting into." And beyond the word padding, a made-for-cable movie, it's just not going to go into that. And I wrote, I didn't write this. I was supposed to highlight this and I forgot. No. I quoted this from his interview. Wow, I'm stupid. Okay, so I quoted from the interview. I was asked, "Do you want to kind of research into the transgender phenomenon?" And I said, "No, I don't. I want to come to it as sort of innocently as Roy does in a way. Because, this isn't Paris, this isn't Amsterdam. He isn't going to go to clubs where he can meet people. He knows little about it. So I wanted to retain that sort of sense of innocence and discover it myself in a way that perhaps Roy does. But as far as what you have to start with is not a strikingly original sort of character. I mean, he is just a regular guy, and insofar as you play a regular guy, because you never do, because if you are an actor, what interests you is what is special about that person." And Serrano's like, Wilkinson shows no respect to his transsexual character he's playing, and I disagree. Once again, we have this bad faith interpretation of Wilkinson didn't want to do a whole lot of research into what it means to be transgender because he's playing a trans character who does not have access to very many resources beyond what he can find in libraries and medical books and that sort of thing, or in limited time online, because again, this is the early 2000s. And again, another part I'm highlighting. For someone who claims to have little interest in making a film about the adventures of a transgender person, Anderson sure does fancy her film up in all the accoutrement, I don't know how to say that word, of the transsexual transitioning process. The dialogue includes discussions about electrolysis, a play-by-play description of how a vagina is created during male-to-female sex reassignment surgery, and even talk about what breast size Roy can expect after she goes on hormones. Yeah, but she sure did come up with this out of her own imagination. And ignoring the bottom surgery bit, all of these come up in very casual asides that Ruth has with her daughter, because Ruth's daughter is young, curious, wants to know what's happening, and they're not lingered on. There's a scene that is lingered on. I'll get to that in a second. But outside of the bottom surgery, and the bottom surgery itself is at the talk is actually from Ruth's daughter to a group of friends that are spending the night as a sort of way to teach them / gross them out as teen girls do. Again, this is one of those things where I could be reading the best faith interpretation of the movie, and Serrano is the worst faith. But I think the murky middle is that the bottom surgery bit maybe wasn't needed, and because all it kind of does is highlight the daughter's character a bit more and how she wants to freak people out and has an easy way to freak people out, which kind of shines a light on the exoticism and taboo bottom sex surgery can have, especially with the inversion of the penis into the vagina, and having all of that stuff is weirdly metaphorical now that I think about it. But I do think most of what is talked about during the transgender transitioning process is innocuous enough that makes sense for it to come up in the conversation when it does. There's close-ups of Roy's hormone prescriptions and the scene that I was just talking about, where there's a family breakfast scene in which Roy, her wife, and her daughter, who had recently had her first period, all start arguing with each other in an apparent hormone-induced frenzy. Upon watching that scene, I wasn't quite sure if I should be more offended as a woman or a transsexual. For me, that I found a bit annoying because this critique. I'm not so sure about the breakfast scene. The only copy of Normal I could find was on YouTube, and that entire section had no dialogue in it, like no sound whatsoever. So I can't comment on good or worse faith interpretation just on what I saw out of the movement. But this is ignoring the fact that that lineup of the medication was lined up with Irma's own menopause medication, where she is taking many of the same medication that Ruth is. I thought it served more to highlight that there's multiple things going on in their lives, that Irma isn't acting like this in a vacuum. And we already knew she wasn't, because like all of this started with Ruth coming out to her pastor and her wife. So Anderson, on the other hand, did just enough homework about transsexuality to make her film dangerous. She poached and pilfered the transsexual experience without any sense of respect or responsibility for the very people she exploited in the process. Don't really know what I can add on to that. I disagree with her. I think this is a gross misrepresentation of the movie. I think she likes to use dramatics in her writing, especially when regarding cis people with trans people, and how cis people handle trans people in fiction. So, because she's comparing this to South Park and Ace Ventura, and it's just, Cool. Fuck you. Alright, so now we're getting to the novel Middlesex. His Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Middlesex centers on an intersex person named Cal, who is raised female until he discovers his condition during puberty. The book follows Cal as he develops male physical attributes and eventually a male identity. Don't like the eventually a male identity. Cal has a male identity throughout the book, and I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it one day. I can't go into this book like I have the movie. We've talked about why I can't in the past. I found an interview from Ungendering, and I found this quote salient. After Middlesex was published, did you receive any feedback from the intersex community? I've received a lot of mail from intersex people, and I'm happy to say it's almost universally positive. While writing the book, I was in contact with ISNA, the Intersex Society of North America, and when the book originally appeared and far people knew about it, the ISNA people appeared pleased with my treatment of the subject. At a reading I did in Portland once, I was briefly picketed by some intersex people who objected to my use of the term hermaphrodite. They find the term pejorative. I met with them briefly after my reading and discussed their objections. The accommodation I came to is as follows. When speaking about living people, I try to use the word intersex, but when speaking about Greek mythology and literary characters like Sirius, I reserve the right to use the normative historical term hermaphrodite. The word comes to us from the myth of Hermaphroditus, after all. And who am I to throw out Greek myths? But yes, I've gotten a lot of feedback from intersex people, letters of thanks, fascinating emails. People come up to me after my readings to tell me things I didn't know. From what I hear, Middlesex is also being read by lots of pediatric endocrinologists, so both sides of the debate are reading the book, and hopefully something good may come of it. In addition, I did find a review on the ISNA website that I will be linking. While talking about the book has its flaws, but is overall a sensitive and realistic glimpse into aspects of being intersex. Interestingly enough, the link about criticism actually leads to the quote at the start of the chapter. That's how I found the quote at the start of the chapter, by the way. I also need to emphasize that while I may not agree with Eugenides' thing about using the word hermaphrodite for literary characters, because I'm perisex as far as I'm aware, so I have no way to qualify my statements. I also want to highlight that he is of a Greek background, so that may be playing into part of why he wants to quote-unquote respect Greek mythology. But going back to Serrano, rather than be inconvenienced by the overwhelming depression and isolation that often typifies the lives of gender-variant people, Eugenides sets out to invent his own new and improved intersex story. I wanted to write about a real person with a real condition. I did a lot of research on the details, but in terms of figuring out what the hermaphrodites psychologically went through, I did that from my imagination. That's how I work. I try to identify my narrator and my characters as much as I can instead of going out, observing other intersex people, and focusing on the details. Hopefully I make the right assumptions and choices about all these characters so that someone who is interested in intersex reads the book. My only comment is, oh no, someone didn't want to write about a trans tragedy, how terrible. We've had discussions before about how, generally, not on this channel, about how a lot of cis-het people's writings of queer characters is queer tragedy. And that comes from the whole movie thing where queer, non-conforming people had to be punished. I'm so sorry, Serrano, that someone decided to write a book that wasn't full of depression. I'm being heavily sarcastic because I don't know why that is such a focus for her, and it is. The book reads like an intersex adventure story, with colorful scenes of Cal's visit with an eccentric John Money-esque doctor who wishes to perform non-consensual genital surgery on him, or is befriending other intersex people, as well as transsexuals, when he fulfills the standard gender-variant person cliche of working as a performer at a sex club. But you don't want all the tragedy and other stuff that constantly goes through, sure. Cal's narration remains remarkably light, humorous, and generally above the fray at all times, as though it had been whitewashed of all the shame, self-loathing and self-consciousness that plagues gender-varying adolescents as their bodies, identities, and behaviors are placed under society's microscope. So she wants trans tragedies and intersex tragedies and the gay tragedies. I think it would shock her a lot to realize that there's a lot of gender nonconforming people who don't experience this level of self-loathing that she's describing. There are plenty that is, but maybe not everyone wants to read those stories all the time. It's just a thought. Eugenides and Anderson both claim to use intersexuality and transsexuality merely as metaphors, but this is clearly disingenuous, because she can go into their brains. What consistently grabbed people's attention in book reviews and interviews was its intersex protagonist, because it's about him growing up and learning he's intersex. And while Normal may be a film about marriage, it was clearly marketed as a film about transsexuality. I don't know about the marketing, but yeah, the whole transitioning thing is a kind of a big part of it. It's how transitioning affects Ruth and Irma's marriage. And they end up becoming stronger for it, which I like. It didn't have to end in tragedy. It may have slid into Irma being super accepting a lot sooner than her character might have, but at the end of the day, it's a story. Eugenides and Anderson capitalized on the taboo nature of intersexuality and transsexuality without acknowledging the fact that the stigma associated with these conditions forces real people to the margins of society. These writers took two of the most maligned and misunderstood sexual minorities in existence, hollowed them out, and poured in their own non-intersex, cissexual biases, inclinations, and impressions. I have a bit that I wrote, but first, I don't know about Middlesex, but Normal definitely pushed Ruth to the edges of society. She gets isolated in an office job versus working on the floor. She ends up getting ostracized from her church. She gets bullied by people she used to consider friends. I don't understand why Serrano insists on everything being black or white. There is no shades of gray. Is it the best representation out there? Definitely not. Is Eugenides' interviews problematic in many aspects? Definitely yes. But why should people not be allowed to create things that are outside of their own experiences? If anything, having cisgender and perisex people start writing and researching and learning about trans and intersex conditions, everyone knows that knowledge ends up being the thing that helps irrational hatred and fear dissipate. But apparently, cis perisex people aren't ever allowed to write anything outside of their own experiences. So, adding the next subsection, toying with gender ambiguous characters. And it's talking about media involving sexually amorphous characters. There's Julia Sweeney's character Pat on Saturday Night Live, and I can't really comment on that. I decided I didn't really want, after watching Normal, to delay this video for too long, and then I did it anyway, so I might as well should have, but I didn't. I'm gonna admit it. I didn't look at it. I don't think Saturday Night Live is the best show anyway. I never found it funny. Then there's another ungendered character in Diane DiMassa's comic strip, Hothead Asian Homicidal Lesbian Terrorist. And there's a quote. When they are first dating, Daphne mentions, "I'm just low on friends. Mine took off because they couldn't handle it." After Hothead asks why, Daphne explains, "I'm in the middle of a large-scale transition. Look at me. Do you see?" The fact that this large-scale transition is a physical one, and that Daphne follows with, "I'm telling you now so you can do what you gotta do. If you're going to fly away, I'd rather just get it over with." DiMassa is clearly leading the audience to believe that Daphne is transsexual. This is further evident in a later episode when Hothead imagines asking, "So Daphne, what's the story? You got a dick or pussy or what?" The quotes, I can't go into the comic because I can't find them online, and I didn't want to buy it. There's a lot of there's some stuff I'll tell you at the end of this, but I didn't want to buy the book just to try and find these. But it doesn't really sound like Ungendering to me. You gotta let me know if it does to you. I forgot that Daphne, Serana talks about how Daphne has very feminine characteristics, including breasts, long hair, a feminine name, but it never comes right out as saying that she's transsexual. I wrote, why does it have to be stamped on her ass? Even then, if she's wearing pants, you won't see it, or long shorts, or a skirt. And there is some stuff where it's like, Hothead Pasian was at the Women's Music Festival, which we talked about in the past being transphobic as fuck. Masa says Daphne has become a sort of transgender hero character, but I never used that word. I never said which way she was going. I never said if she was FTM or NTF. And I wrote, it sounds like you're upset your hero ended up shitty, but when I see the comic summarized as following the violent exploits of Hothead, a lesbian feminist who tortures and slaughters predatory men, I immediately have several questions about the creator's political alignment. And scrolling down, I highlight, to be honest, I would have no problem if their stories contain characters that magically transition from one sex to another, but instead they chose to base their gender transformations in reality, a reality where transsexual and intersex people are marginalized, where our voices are seldom heard. I have no comment on that. All I can say is maybe she'd really like gender-bending fanfiction. Fables of the Deconstruction. One of the earliest examples of this approach is sociologist Harold Garfinkel's 1967 book, Studies of Anthromethodology, which attempted to elucidate how members of society produce stable, accountable, practical activities, i.e. social structures of everyday activities. Garfinkel devoted 70 pages to describing Angie's attempt, who is a trans woman, to reconcile her female identity and feminine behavior with the fact that she had male genitals. The account is extraordinarily objectifying, and not only with regard to Garfinkel's descriptions of Angie's body, such as her measurements were 38, 25, 38, and she is dressed in a tight sweater which marked off her thin shoulders, ample breasts, and narrow waist. He spends page after page relishing the details of how she managed to pass as a woman, highlighting her anxiety around this discrepancy between her anatomy and gender identity, and pointing out what he believed were inconsistencies in her personal history and her claims that she always felt like a girl. The entitled way he picks apart Angie's life, graphically chronicling her fears, secrets, embarrassments, and insecurities, shows no regard for her as a person, or for the immense difficulty she must have faced in simply trying to survive and make sense of her life as a gender-variant person living in the 1950s. And I did write, I looked up on Amazon, it says the paperback is about 304 pages, so the book is about 23% about Angie's, according to all of this. I don't know if the 70 pages is in hardback, paperback, she doesn't say. I find using pages as counting completely arbitrary if you don't quantify it within the book itself. But it is interesting seeing her suddenly switch. We go from fiction, where she wants all the harsh realities of everything to be talked about the self-loathing and the depression and the self-disgust and the feeling like you're not belonging in your own body, to reality. Someone heavily documents a single person's life experiences and points to the inconsistencies and talks about it. These things that Angie herself probably talked about and pointed out and was part of her insecurity, and she hates it. Again, this is one of those moments where I don't know how much of this is being twisted out of character, but I'm sure it's pretty heinous because this book was published in 1967, and then there is Herculine Barbin, who is a historical figure. There is Foucault did an English translation, I believe, and he makes it clear in his introduction his interest in publishing this 19th century account of an intersex person stems solely from the fact that it challenges the modern Western notion that all people have a true sex. I highlighted that mostly because I think she's salty because it goes against her beliefs that people do have true sexes, hence the non-binary people will only partially express their subconscious sex. But also she's really Western about this. She seems to take offense at the idea that there has to be a binary, but every other turn she kind of reinforces the fact that there's a binary. In any non-white colonialist expectation of gender variance or third genders is, oh, they're actually trans women, but they are being othered and disliked, or whatever. So there's a bit of double think going on, in my opinion. Let's see. There is the fact that both Foucault and Garfinkel claim to be making larger points about gender in society. Foucault, that society imposes a true sex in all its members. Garfinkel, that we all actively manage and produce our gendered sense of self. And I highlighted the society imposes a true sex in all its members, and I wrote, is it not trans and intersex people that get crushed the hardest on denying their AGAB? But again, she really seems to hate Foucault. And then there is talking about Herculean and Angines. After all, one only has to look at how apologetic people become when they accidentally misgender another person, or how insulting it is generally considered to be to suggest that someone's femaleness or maleness is suspect in any way, to understand that ungendering is an inherently demeaning process. If Foucault and Garfinkel had instead chosen to pick apart the gender identities of young people who were not gender variant, the process of ungendering would have undoubtedly and appropriately seemed intrusive and disrespectful. I agree and disagree. I think Garfinkel's stuff would work better if, I'm taking this at face value, if he had combined Angie's story with a cisgender woman's perspective as well in her own childhood, and pointing out incongruities with her gender identity, how sometimes we have moments where we don't think that we fit in the mold. A good example would be Turf Talking Head JKR. She talks about in her essay, manifesto, whatever, that if she had been born a couple decades later, she may have thought herself non-binary or trans man. And who knows, maybe she would have. But she doesn't currently identify as that. That would have added more stuff. I can't say much about Foucault because she's getting a lot of her stuff from an introduction to a story that had already been published in French, I believe. And she's picking apart his desire to share a story that doesn't fit in with the idea of binary or AGAB sex. And jumping down, having experienced firsthand what it's like to feel a disconnect between my own physical sex and gender identity, having deeply internalized the shame that's associated with a body that defies public expectations of what is natural and normal, and having experienced the profound sense of isolation that comes with being a young gender variant person, I found the lengthy, graphic descriptions that Foucault and Garfinkel provide shamelessly voyeuristic. These accounts are akin to offering an explicit play-by-play description of a rape scene for the sole purpose of making some rather generic point about human sexuality. This is a good summation of Serrano's entire book thus far. She is putting her biases onto these works, which everyone does. It's totally fair. And she comes away with her decisions on what the work is about. And instead of looking at other people's reviews and other people's studies and dissertations and books written on this stuff and seeing what other people think about it and allowing that to possibly change her mind or influence what she writes, she looks at and nitpicks the smallest things. She tears out little sound bites from longer reviews that she feels will support her narrative. And she takes interviews and she twists them into something they're not to demonize people who she doesn't think are doing enough. And if that just isn't reminiscent of what the internet and online discourse has come to, I don't know what else is. I could end it there, but no, we've got like 3 more pages. Jumping down to in Foucault's writings, which ironically focused on how institutions produce and regulate sexual identities have formed the foundation of queer theory, a field that has practically institutionalized the practice of ungendering gender-variant persons in an attempt to demonstrate how our culture's notions on binary sex gender are socially constructed. This made me snort after reading Butler's quote on the wiki. Alright, so when you go into his wiki, there is the section about theory of the body and sexuality. And the second to last paragraph, we jump down to seeing like being considered one of the founders of queer theory. There is no natural fundament that lies behind identities such as gay, lesbian, heterosexual, etc. They're considered cultural constructions. Feminists have, with the help of Foucault's ideas, studied different ways that women form their bodies, plastic surgery, diet, eating disorders, etc. Foucault's historization of sex has also affected feminist theorists such as Judith Butler, who used Foucault's theories about the relation between subject power and sex to question gendered subjects. Butler follows Foucault by saying that there is no true gender behind gender identity that constitutes its biological and objective fundament. However, Butler is critical of Foucault. She argues Foucault naively presents bodies and pleasures as a ground for resistance against power without extending his historization of sexuality to gendered subjects/bodies. Foucault has received criticism from other feminists such as Susan Bordeaux and Kate Soper. Serrano doesn't even get mentioned, so I wonder what that means. One particularly illustrative example of how dehumanizing academic ungendering can be is found in Bernice Hausman's book, Changing Sex, discussed previously in Chapter 7. Please go see my previous 2 videos about Chapter 7, because that was a mess. In the preface, Hausman describes the difficulty she had finding a topic related to identity in feminist theory for her dissertation. No matter how much I applied myself to the task, most of my thoughts on the issue seemed uninspired, boring, even obvious. But then, lucky for her, she discovered transsexuality. I inadvertently found texts that dealt with transsexualism. Now that was really fascinating. For about 6 months I read anything and everything I could find about cross-dressing and sex change. I attended a national conference for transvestites and transsexuals. The possibilities for understanding the construction of gender through an analysis of transsexualism seemed enormous, and there wasn't a lot of critical material out there. And then Serrano is like, of course, she then uses a Foucauldian method of understanding gender. So we can see the entire reason she hates Foucault is that it goes against her idea that there is a scientific bioessentialist underpinning to one's true sex. She does not like the fact that he says there's no true sex, no true gender, that sort of thing. She really, really hates that. And it's fascinating. However, the very goal of queer theory, denaturalizing and deconstructing the binary sex-gender system, inevitably tempts many scholars to appropriate the bodies and experiences of those people who are most marginalized by that very system. She just really hates queer theory. And I guess, since we already had kind of gone into academia in Chapter 7, she's just using this as a chance to re-hammer in the idea that queer theory and the idea that most, if not all, gender expression and gender identity is socially constructed. She wants to really hammer in that that's wrong. So now we're jumping down to someone named Prosser. His critique touches on a certain level of unacknowledged intellectual dishonesty regarding academic ungendering. Cissexual academics eagerly cite aspects of gender-variant lives that support their claims that gender is primarily constructed, while ignoring those aspects that undermine their cases. I don't disagree with this, but she also does the same. For example, many academics have focused on the transsexual transition process to argue that gender roles do not arise, or gender does not arise naturally, but it is learned, practiced, and performed. However, these same academics tend to overlook or dismiss outright the fact that most transsexuals experience a lifelong self-knowing that they should be the other sex. This self-knowing exists despite the overwhelming social pressure for a person to identify and behave as a member of their assigned sex, which strongly suggests that there are indeed natural and intrinsic gender inclinations that can precede and or supersede social conditioning and gender norms. I also find it disingenuous that academics in gender studies and sociology tend to concentrate rather exclusively on those gender-variant individuals who are most easily ungendered, transsexuals who have just embarked on the transitioning process, intersex people who are in the process of being treated by medical institutions, and those transgender people who actively engage in drag, gender bending, and or who identify outside the male-female binary. All these groups should be given a voice. What regularly goes unreported are the views of transsexuals who are 10 or 20 years post-transition, intersex people who have lived fairly gender-normative heterosexual lives, and trans people who at one point embraced being in between or outside the categories of female or male as part of their coming out experience, but who later came to identify within the male-female binary, aka Serrano herself. These populations of gender-variant people tend to have completely different experiences and opinions around gender. Their stories are never told, most likely because they are at odds with the positions and theories put forward by most academic gender researchers. While some transsexual and intersex people do identify outside of the gender binary, most of us experience a profound understanding of ourselves as being female or male. So that's all. That was like 2 paragraphs in a sentence. All to say, she is butthurt that people who are post-transition, and again, I'm not one of those people that really believe there is a post-transition, because there's always the danger of being outed, that sort of thing. But she's upset that people who are post-transition don't have their voices told, and she's ignoring the fact that the groups that she's identifying as being the most outspoken tend to be people who are the most visible and most vulnerable. This isn't to say that a trans woman who has been on HRT for 10 to 30 years isn't still visible in some way, because we know that testosterone is a hell of a drug, and quote-unquote mannish, to use a terrible term, women are oftentimes ostracized or othered, especially back when she was writing this. And the ideal was 100% the thin, pretty, even if they're tomboyish or wearing the baggy clothes, just slender, that sort of thing. Almost androgynous woman. Because androgyny is, the idea of androgyny is still leans towards the feminine, which annoys me. And for that last sentence about the most experienced being in the binary, she doesn't cite any sources, so I can't say anything. So when non-intersex, cissexual academics use gender-variant bodies and experiences to unravel the gender binary, they are essentially undermining our efforts to have our self-identifications taken seriously. And this is an argument I saw a lot right when I was a baby trans, just starting to understand what it is, the idea that gender not being real hurts binary gender people. And you see that a lot with gender critical TERFs, that sort of thing, which makes it hard for me to say that I'm a gender abolitionist, because I actually respect gender binaries as they are understood today, and I don't think they're ever going to go away fully. But gender critical feminist TERFs do believe that I don't know, gender is a construct, the sex is real, whatever, I don't care. I'm not going to get into that right now, but yeah, I do see some of that argument sometimes, and it's, I don't know how to explain that you can say something is constructed but still respect the people that find joy in that construct. or that that construct isn't something that needs to just be dismissed out of hand, because it still affects people and is a valuable tool to discuss what's going on in society. But we are at the end. There's one more paragraph that I highlighted. So let's get through it. I am sure that some readers will object to this call for artists and academics to stop appropriating intersex and transsexual identities and experiences. I'm being called out. But at this point in time, when almost no intersex and transsexual voices reach the public, and the few who do are those that are non-intersex, cissexual individuals deemed worthy, those who do attempt to speak as our proxies, who claim to understand our bodies, our issues, or our identities, necessarily push us further into the margins. Perhaps in the future, when most people are familiar with the work of intersex and transsexual artists and academics, when the body of work that we have produced is so large that no one non-intersex or cissexual person can drown out our voices, other artists and intellectuals will be able to discuss our existence and our experiences in a respectful, non-exploitive way. But until that time comes, non-intersex, cissexual artists and academics should put their pens down, open up their minds, and simply listen to what we have to say about our own lives. So that is chapter 9. And I don't like it. I don't like with her, well, I do agree with her ending statements to a point. In an ideal world, we would be able to put non-perisex, non-cisgender voices first and foremost in these discussions. But unfortunately, that's not how reality works. We know this from historical precedent, and we know this is a slow scraping process that we have to build a foundation that then the intersex and the transgender voices can step upon. And we're seeing that. These stories that she is critiquing and saying aren't enough are the building blocks that then allowed transgender people like Laverne Cox to then step up and become more involved in the creation process of trans stories, and have allowed more trans and intersex voices to be heard. I don't think calling a taboo on everything a perisex or cisgender person writes, if they're talking about intersex or transgender people, is a good idea, because we also want to get away from what she seems to want, which is the torture porn of queer characters or intersex characters, because not all intersex identify as queer. And I don't know. Her approach to art and my approach to art are incredibly different, and it's pretty interesting to see both as far as the time scale, because she is significantly older than I am, and she's definitely seen media that treated trans people like a joke, versus me, who was born in 1993 and didn't come into trans circles or really online until I was an adult. And I'm in this glorious world where the internet allows us to highlight and support individual creators in a way that mass media back in Serrano's time just wouldn't. You had to appeal to the masses or you would become a literal starving artist. Now, if you can convince enough people to follow your Patreon to cover your rent, you may not have to work a full-time job, and you can create more stories that are important to you. And it's a great way to get queer voices, disabled voices, black and brown voices out there in a way that wasn't possible. So I think a lot of my judgments on this chapter simply comes from my understanding of how things have worked historically, how minority voices do become more accepted the more that disabilities and queerness are openly talked about, and not necessarily it always starts as a torture porn or romanticizing illness, that sort of thing. but then you leave that circle and you slowly open up to more. And I think Serrano just wants to ignore the fact that there's a process, even though the process sucks, and jump right to the end. And it's a delicate, complicated process, and I can understand someone's frustration and the feeling of voyeurism, though I don't agree with the way she's talking about some of this stuff. And you can see a lot of her biases comes from the idea that she feels her gender identity, her transsexuality, is linked into biology to the point where anyone who says, hey, maybe it's constructed, you can still be happy, you can still see this in you this entire time. But that's not true for everyone. And we don't know how stuff affects us in the nurture wise, because babies come out of the womb with a fucking accent. We can't like completely isolate a fetus, not only because it'd be incredibly inhumane and cruel, but because right now we don't have the technology to have a viable womb outside of a body. And even that parent who is carrying that child is affecting the way the child is internalizing stuff while they're in the womb. It's fascinating, really, but there is no way that we could create a perfect world where we don't have those biases put into people at some way. And yeah, I don't know what else to say. This was a short chapter, not a short video. It never is. I talk way too much, but let me know what you think. We're going to get into chapter 10 and 11 in June. Maybe before the end of the year we can finish it out. Oh, and my last thing is, I mentioned I'd talk about this. I've been thinking, because I've been keeping all of my notes, and there's a lot of stuff I'm not able to get into because I don't have access to the books or the story or the articles that she's referencing. After I finish reading Whipping Girl, I may go through again and start creating a sort of annotated guide to kind of talk about the pitfalls and bring in those resources and allow me to read stuff like Middlesex and just see what's going on in that. And I have someone who's willing to help me with that project, but let me know if you guys would be interested. This would probably be something that's not finished until 2025, considering the rate that I'm reading Whipping Girl to begin with. I'm not saying it's going to take me till 2025 to read it. It's just I want to read the whole thing and then go through my notes and start pulling out the stuff that I want to research more. So yeah, let me know what you guys think about that. It may be a great way to reach people who don't like listening to videos or have trouble listening to audio, that sort of thing, or find my voice grating for one reason or another. But yeah, that's going to be it from me today. I plan on making another video at the start of June. I want to do another sex ed, or at least sex ed adjacent one. I miss making those. And I think I'm slowly getting to a point where I can be more regular. I know I keep saying that. I promise it's coming. It's a lot. I also want to update you guys when I get through staining the floors, because that's an exciting process. So, yeah, until next time, I will talk to y'all later. Bye.